Okay, well, welcome everybody, and welcome to the latest in our regular series of Meet the Author video sessions. My name's John Holtz. I'm the current Technical Director of Incosi UK, and I'm very pleased today to have two authors of our latest book, which is the Don't Panic Guide to Architecture and Architecting, which I've been assured is a real verb, and I'm sure we'll get explanations of this as we go on. Our two authors that are joining us today are Tim Rabbets of Kinetic and Mike Wilkinson of BAE Systems. So first of all, welcome guys. How are we both today?
Yeah, very good, thanks, John.
Okay, Tim, everything okay with you?
Yep, very well, very busy.
And Tim's been very good, because if you look in the background, you can actually see he's got his official Don't Panic 4 series of books behind him, which will also delight Paul Davis, who's one of our other authors, who's come to keep his eye on the competition today. So just to get going then, the same question I ask all the people when we start this is just ask you to give us a bit of background on what made you write the book in the first place. What was your sort of motivation behind it, and just give us a bit of background on that. So Tim, would you like to start us off with that, please?
So I think we've reached a degree of maturity in systems architecting, such that we're in a position to write something more thoughtful and concise on the subject. It's actually incredibly difficult writing something concise. And the second reason is that I'm also involved in writing international standards for ISO on architectural matters. And I thought it was important for a UK perspective on the subject to be available in a fairly concise form to influence the architecting standards community moving forwards. So that's my basic reason.
Okay, Mike?
Well, I was going to say that we were inspired by the example of the first one in the series, John. To attempt to write something equally concise and powerful. But yeah, I mean, I think we felt there was a bit of a gap, actually. So there's lots of learned textbooks about architecture, but they do tend to be drawn from a specific perspective, so that they give you a particular flavour of viewpoints on what architecture is really all about. And we felt there was a lack of something that was a bit more synthetic, that would bring all the different perspectives together within a single way of looking at the whole of architecting. So hopefully we were able to do that. So as Tim said, it's quite hard to write something concise. And in fact, it's not just summarising what's already out there. The trick, I think, is really to try and produce something which has a new way of looking at the problem, a new way of looking at what architecture is, that is helpful in terms of understanding and getting to grips with the subject.
Okay, and it's interesting what you say about some of the existing texts on architecture, because some of them can be quite big volumes and it can be quite dry as well. And I think one of the difficulties that people have is finding a good entry point into learning about a new subject, which is one of the reasons why we launched the Don't Panic books in the first place. But I think this was as you say, I think there was a bit of a gap in the market there. And I think, as you say, a lot of the architecture books are kind of loaded towards a particular area, for example, enterprise architecture or whatever it's going to be. So do you feel then that you've hit the target of making it accessible to somebody that's very new to architecture then? Could they pick your book up, and what are they going to learn from it?
Yeah, we'd hope so. We tried to strike a balance between being accessible but not being oversimplistic. And again, that's a tricky balance to get right. We did test out the draft on a number of people of varying degrees of experience. So, and of course, it all gets reviewed by the Incosi reviewers as well before it gets accepted. So hopefully there's been enough testing of it to make sure that it is reasonably accessible to people.
We use it in Kinetic as our introductory book for people joining this area of work. And, we've bought 100 copies, which I'm frantically distributing and running mentoring sessions off the back of. So most of our young graduates go off and read it, and then they come back with lots of questions. but it is a useful starting point before getting into some of the more detailed literature, is what we find.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a really good example. It's a really good usage, and we've seen that with a couple of the other Don't Panic guides as well, where big organisations have actually bought them in bulk. You know, well, what for us as in Cozy UK is bulk, like say 100 copies, and then they're becoming these sort of de facto standards in the way that people work. And I think that's one of the exciting things that we didn't quite anticipate, to be honest, when we launched the series, but it's happened on a number of the Don't Panics at the moment. And it's really, it's very encouraging. Obviously, it's very good for Cozy UK as well. It's very good for the authors, but I think it's a really good endorsement of the quality of the book that you produced as well. Now, the last one of these sessions that we did, I'll notice a couple of the guys that are on this one. So Teo's joined us from Germany, and he was on the last one as well. And that was all about architectural frameworks that was obviously sort of closely related, and that was James Towers and Aurelius, as you know. And, you know, a question I put that to them last time is, how do you go about ensuring that you don't tread on each other's toes when you're both writing a guide that's obviously there's going to be some overlap between them? So how did you go about that?
So we did exchange drafts between ourselves, and we're obviously aware of each other's proposed list of contents. And also through work in ISO, I was also aware of the likely developments in key texts in the field. So it's enabled us all in step and also forward looking in what we've been able to put into both books, which I think has been advantageous.
Yeah, of course, we obviously know James and Aurelius as well, and there is an activity at the moment which is a joint initiative between the Architecture Working Group and the MBSE Working Group, which is looking at the interplay between architecture and models. So we're already pretty much in contact with their way of thinking, but yeah, we as Tim said, we did the simple thing of exchanging draft. That's how we did it.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other thing is to pick up a bit further. You know, we've tried to keep the book in step with the other precursor books, including yours, John, and Paul Davies' book on interface definition, so that certainly for my employers, we're proposing to buy more copies of these books and use them as a more general introduction for many of our staff into the area of systems engineering. And we're finding it a very good entry point into lots of different areas through using this series, because they're not too difficult to read. You can read them in an hour or two, and the language isn't too complicated, and there are a few illustrations and case studies in there to bring a bit of life to things.
Okay, and you mentioned you've been mentioning Cozy UK in the Architecture Working Group, and Tim, you've also mentioned you're involved with ISO, with the, I guess it's the sort of 42010 and the associated series of standards. So how important is having that as the background, is having some sort of frame of reference? So, you know, how much influence did, for example, in Cozy UK and ISO, you know, what did they bring to the table, really?
So it's a two-way influence. We've used previous in Cozy UK white papers to influence the 42000 series of standards, and conversely, obviously, we feed back what the current international thinking is about architectural concerns and considerations, to try and reflect that thinking, or where our views differ from it, to explain why our views differ from it on a UK national basis.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that the Architecture Working Group has been going for many years and has produced many products of different kinds, conference papers and white papers and all sorts of stuff. So in the front of the book, we do acknowledge the broader contribution of the working group to all of the various conversations we've had about architecture over the years, and that sort of evolving maturity of perspective on architecture that we've been able to obtain.
Okay.
I can see.
Sorry, Tim, go on.
Through ISO, we're engaged with people around the world. So we're engaged very heavily with AFIS in France, for example. and AFIS publishes its own set of systems engineering guides. And I suspect that moving forwards, we may look at some bilateral publication routes to try and harmonize thinking, and also to influence the international community where our views particularly align.
Okay.
Yes. There is, of course, an international architecture working group as well, that is Incosi International, which I've been involved with quite a bit in the past, and we've obviously linked into that where appropriate as well. But that tends to be a forum that meets less frequently than ours, and it tends to be focused mainly on reviewing standards and contributing to standards, in fact. So a bit of a narrow focus for it, I suppose.
Okay. Now I can see Paul Davis has had his hand up for the last couple of minutes. So Paul, have you got a question for people?
Yeah, so it's just simple that you mentioned about link-ups between UK working group, AFIS, and the international working group. Do you see any differences in philosophy and style as regards architecting and architectures? Is there a difference of mental models, if you like, and particularly as that relates to any perceived differences between architecture and design, which I notice you avoid talking about completely in the book?
That's because we're working on another one, John. Sorry, Richard, just called design. So we're looking at that one. Yeah, I mean, Tim's been in the working groups, the international working group for and everything recently. But I mean, I was previously the chair of the international architecture working group. So I'll kick off and just say that there are numerous perspectives from all over the place. So even within a company, I think you find that there are people with different perspectives as to what architecture is all about. I'm not sure whether there's a national characterization particularly, but Tim might have a different view on that. But there are certainly many perspectives, that's for sure.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on who you're talking to. And I think my main contacts in France, they have a very much more of a philosophically based approach to systems engineering and architecting, which is perhaps unsurprising given the French way of doing things. They certainly have a particular take on topics like enterprise architecture, which is somewhat out of step with some of the UK thinking.
Yeah, I know, I'd agree with that, having worked for Jean-Luc for about 5 years. Yeah. But it depends whether that is just a Jean-Luc view or is it sort of widespread throughout France. It's difficult to tell, isn't it?
It is quite surprising how influential certain people are, actually. So, you know, you find it's the same old crowd who turn up to the Working Group 42 meetings and who actually do a lot of the work on it, and then who represent Incosi in some forums. And it's, yeah, there are some forceful characters, I would say, who are very influential in the way the thinking goes. Whether they're always correct or you know, always on the money is a different question. But yeah,
there was a guy whose name I can't remember who was kind of Tim's equivalent to DGA, the French Defence Procurement Agency. Wish I could remember his name. Who had equally forceful views on how French Defence Forces architected themselves.
I mean, it's interesting. We've seen these. You know, you mentioned France, but we're selling, and we were quite surprised about this when we launched the series. But we're actually selling these books. They're going all around the world at the moment, which is very positive. And also, we're about to. I mean, you will know this being the authors, and Paul will as well. We're going to ebooks as well. They're going to be available, if not this week, then certainly next week. We're just waiting for a couple more signatures to come in. And that's going to open up the international market quite significantly. And of course, we're going to be making them all available on to buy through Amazon as well. But we've been surprised by the, as I say, by the number of purchases we've had from different countries around the world. And I think that's another good indication of how well written the books have been so far. And it's interesting, Mike, when you mentioned, for example, white papers. I know you were involved in quite a big white paper on architecting that was a product of the architecture working group a few years ago. And I think one of the interesting things about the books is because I think maybe it's because they're books with, as in you can put them on your shelf with an ISBN number and so on. We seem to be selling a lot more of them. I think the fact it's a book as well makes them a little bit more accessible, and maybe a bit less intimidating than something like a white paper. That's obviously, there's different purposes, and there's a different point behind them. But I know some people can find things like that quite intimidating. So I think this is filling quite a nice gap there. And as I said, when we're looking at the sales that we're getting sort of around the world, it's certainly very encouraging. But there we go. Okay, hang on, I just need to let somebody else in. So at this point then, are there any of the attendees that have got any questions they'd like to address the authors before we move on, or any comments they'd like to make at this point? Okay.
I was going to ask a question. So with regard to architecture and architecting, what do you find are the things that people get wrong initially? So if I'm having a conversation with somebody about architecture and architecting, what should I be thinking about in terms of, well, that these are the assumptions they're going to make and these are the things they're going to get wrong?
I think very often people will dive into the solution space, where we would always recommend thinking about what the problem is before you start working on the solution. Even if you don't necessarily have a purist sort of top-down approach, if that's not possible. So there are many ways you can navigate around building an architecture, and people will often assume that it is a standard top-down kind of approach. So there's a sort of tension there, because on the one hand they want to create solutions immediately, and on the other hand they're trying to work top-down from starting with a user requirement or something and then going linearly through a process. So I think what we've tried to express in the book is that you need to really tailor your thinking for the kind of problem that you're actually addressing, and the kind of system that you're addressing. And there is a number of drivers that will influence the way you go about doing things. So I think possibly people don't appreciate the degree of tailoring that is required in order to get a good approach, and it isn't really just picking a recipe off the shelf and following it. That's probably isn't going to be entirely successful in your particular situation. Who knows, it might, but likely it won't match exactly.
To add to that, I think as with all systems engineering, you should always think about what is it you're trying to achieve. I see lots of early career staff who say, I'm going to use this method or this tool or do things this way, without thinking through what is it are you trying to achieve. So I always tend to go back to the basics and then work out things subsequently. And specifically over architecture, the book labours the point that it's all about structure and properties. And I think that's a very important message for people to understand, because some people stray into design and other areas very easily. So that's what we've tried to do, bring some clarity to the subject and emphasize those fundamental issues that you need to think about.
There's a lot of ancillary considerations as well, like which tool you're going to use, which language you're going to use, the modeling that you're going to do, and all that kind of thing. And it's very easy to get wrapped up in all of those details, as Tim was saying, without really understanding why you're doing a certain thing. So I would always recommend that you decide which aspects of architecture you're going to deal with, and what you're going to do with them, i.e. why are you doing that particular thing. So if you're thinking of building models, figure out which models you want to create or which viewpoints you want to create, and understand what you're going to do with them. So what analyses you're going to perform on them, and how that's going to be supporting your overall systems engineering process. So yeah, knowing why you're doing it is, as in all fields of life, absolutely critical.
Okay. I'd like to sort of change the tack a little bit now, and I'd like to ask you a little bit more about your sort of writing style. So, for example, I know some of you know that the series editor of all the Don't Panic books is Simon Perry, who's I collaborate with on a regular basis, and we've got very, very different styles. So, for example, there doesn't seem to be a buffer between, as you probably realise from having spoken to me in the past, what's in my head and what comes out of the keyboard. I just sort of think and write, and it comes out. Whereas Simon doesn't. He sits and thinks, and of course with me, I think, because I like to blame my dyslexia, but I know it's not all that. But I end up making a lot of edits then, and going back and correcting things. Where Simon thinks about things for a long time, and very rarely has to make any changes whatsoever to what he does, because he sits there and thinks, and then what comes out is almost the end product. Whereas I'm very much a sort of the sort of word vomit onto the paper, if you like. So what are your writing styles? So Tim, what's your kind of style when you're writing things? Are you a thinker or a planner, or does it pour out? How would you describe it?
Mixture, and I have to say it's quite a discipline to try and write in the style of the Don't Panic guide, which we're trying to make as accessible as possible. And I suppose I'm always thinking in my mind of counter examples or instances of experience. And I would say my natural style, having been a researcher for many years, is to write in a more academic style or semi-academic style. And so to write in this quite distilled, hopefully simply worded style is a real challenge for me. But I'm learning, and I hope to do better with the second book.
Yeah, well, I think the style comes across well, actually. But so you found that you found that quite challenging, and to change your natural style of writing, then.
Yeah, I think like many people, it's easy to write a lot more, and to write in a very distilled and correct, and as Mike has emphasised, a very thoughtful style is really quite challenging. So it's not an easy thing to write. Often people say, if I had more time, I'd have written less. Well, we had to write less. So, that's what took the time.
And I think that's one of the most difficult things, isn't it? When you've got a book, and we deliberately put a page limit on it of 55 pages, and when you're up against that, and as I say, we've got Simon there as a series editor to say, no, you can't go over, you can't. It is actually that's quite difficult to get right, isn't it? Is because it's what do you leave out, and it makes you. I found it makes you sort of focus on what truly is important, and I like the word that you use, distilled as well, Tim, because that's really what you're doing, isn't it? It's distilling it down to the absolute fundamentals, and trying to get those across. So, Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think my style is I prefer more of a conversational, informal style. That's how I tend to write. I mean, I write quite a lot of sort of magazine articles and that kind of thing, and bits and pieces inside the company, and I quite enjoy doing that. So it's sort of quite complementary to the more formal style that Tim normally does. I mean, I've also got a background in writing academic papers as well, so I can do that when required, but I prefer something that's a bit more informal.
So you found it a bit more natural for your natural style of doing things, do you think?
Yeah, I would say so. Even then, fitting in with the various graphical devices that are used, the warning signs and the key points and all that sort of thing, was a little bit difficult as well, and I noticed actually some of the authors that interpreted those things slightly differently, but I mean, it's not an issue necessarily, but trying to get your head into the head of Simon Perry, who put the style together, if you like, is actually
that's a very dark place. So.
Quite tricky, yeah. But it's very enjoyable, right? It did take a long time to write it, but not necessarily as long as you would take to write an academic paper, in fact.
Yeah, because it's interesting. So I think we mentioned the architecture in white paper that was out for Go. I think that was probably longer than this book was. It was.
Well, the challenge with writing the white papers is trying to harmonise the writing styles of all the different authors.
Yeah, because I guess that's more of a collective work, isn't it? Than,
yeah, I mean, I think the last white paper we did had about 10 authors on it or something like that. And it's very, very hard to get a uniformity of style there. You kind of tend to have to get someone to take an editorial kind of role in it and just do a little bit of harmonization. But with just Tim and myself working with working together and cross-reviewing each other's work, I mean, that tends to work. That tends to go quite well and easier than the white paper, that's for sure.
So what's your history of collaboration between the two of you then? Have you collaborated on much stuff in the past? Was it, or was this a natural fit for you both to work together?
Yeah.
If I kick off on that.
Very diplomatic answer there, Mike. Yes.
No, I say, please, Tim. I was just inviting Tim to go first.
I joined Mike as to co-chair the UK Architecture Working Group about 5 years ago. And so, we've been collaborating for the last 5 years, in any case, running the Architecture Working Group. And during that time, we've written 2 white papers. Mike's published a manifesto for architecting, which was a more thoughtful piece on the subject and what it's trying to achieve, and perhaps even the direction it should take moving forwards. And we've exchanged a lot of information with the International Architecture Working Group and with ISO Working Group 42. So we've been collaborating quite extensively, and as possibly the 2 leading lights in the UK Architecture Working Group, writing a book was a sensible next step from my perspective anyway.
Right. Okay, Mike?
Yeah, so we've worked together in the Architecture Working Group for a very long time, and we've worked on a number of other projects together, and we still are. So, yeah, it must be working all right. See, there was a comment there from Paul about the paper that I did with Charles Dickerson, which was a very challenging, interesting paper. That actually took about 2 years to get to fruition, and was very hard work with a bunch of academics who wouldn't necessarily agree with each other about anything, and the level of wording precision was immense in that. So, and
the obvious language barrier with the Americans as well. So.
Yeah, well, the American, and we had a Chinese academic and 2 Americans, and lots of difficulty there. There's a question there about how long did it take to write this book?
Yeah, so Sandrine Godfrey, I'll just read it out for the benefit of the other people. So, how long did it take in concrete terms to write the book? And were you obliged to discard some chapters you had prepared to fit into the 55 pages?
So yeah, Tim's answered yes and yes. It took about a year, and we definitely had to slim stuff down, but we had much more material than would fit within the page cap. We actually, I don't know if Simon noticed, but we did go slightly over the page cap. But on the
he noticed. Yeah, he noticed.
Yeah. But yeah, we had a lot of material that had to be discarded, and we had a lot of material that had to be condensed.
So are you tempted to, so bearing in mind with that in COSY UK now we have the advanced applications of systems engineering series of books, which are aimed at sort of more detailed, a bigger, heavier book. Is there a temptation there to write a sort of companion volume that goes into a lot more detail, or?
We have discussed that, haven't we, Tim? I mean, yeah, potentially. I think we want to get the design Don't Panic Guide out of the way first, and then we'll see, what we might want to do next.
In fact, do you want to say a few words about that, Mike? Because you're actually in the process of writing your second Don't Panic Guide. So it's very addictive, isn't it, writing books? We once you've written one, that's it. More. And we've seen that because Paul's working on it. Paul Davis, who wrote the interface one, is also working on a second volume at the moment. So something we put in the COSY UK water, I think. But do you want to say a few words about the next volume that you've got coming up?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, it certainly doesn't help domestic harmony at all to be spending all your time writing books. That's one thing. But now, what we thought, well, Paul actually raised this question earlier on about the relationship between design and architecture. And in fact, although there's a relatively good number of books on architecture, there wasn't really a good introductory one. And I think the same is probably even more true in the design field, where there are lots and lots of detailed design books on particular subspecies of design, such as electrical design or mechanical design or whatever it is. There's not very much really in the literature about design for systems engineering or design as a part of systems engineering. And we felt obliged really to at least address this question about what's the relationship between architecture and design as a complement to the architecture book, really. And also, which Tim will say a bit more about, there's a conversation that we've been involved in regarding the Nkosi handbook, which is currently being updated, and Tim's written a few pieces in there on design, or updated those bits on design. So we felt it was kind of in the air for us, really. It's something that was floating around in our heads, and probably a good idea to put something on paper about it.
Okay. Tim, what are your thoughts on the matter? Can you give us an idea of your thoughts on the new book?
So it's to fill a gap again, and I think bearing in mind, well, taking my employer's perspective for a moment, we've got about 500 systems engineers in Kinetic, and a significant shortage. There's a significant shortage of systems engineers moving forwards. So combinations of training and mentoring, and also self-development, and being able to hand out copies of books and then have mentoring sessions and discussion sessions, tutorials following on from that, is quite a good way of imparting knowledge. And what we need to do with my employers is try and train up and develop our systems engineers at a far faster rate, rather than relying on 30 years before you can be let loose on some of the more complex problems that we have to solve. So it sort of fits in with, perhaps you also reach a certain age where you feel you need to impart knowledge to the next generation moving along, and therefore it perhaps comes quite naturally for one generation to start writing books. But the aim with much of what I do now is to try and help the next generation and not go through some of the pain that I've gone through. So I certainly found that the first time I had a brush with architecture, which was about 25 years ago, I didn't really understand what it was all about. And so many of our youngsters and early careers people have the same sort of experience still, that hopefully things like the Don't Panic guides and the other professional publications will make their lives a lot easier moving forwards.
And I think that's a really good point, because I remember when we wrote the first one, which was a bit of an experiment, because we weren't sure how it would be received, that Simon and I wrote. And one of the drivers behind that is we sat down and we said, well, when we started this, and similar time frame again, Tim, 25, 30 years ago when we started in this game, it was well, what's the book that we wish existed then that didn't exist? Because and I think it's very important what you say there. You don't want people to go through all the pain that you've been through. You want people to learn by your experiences, and the things that have taken literally decades to suddenly dawn on you, and to get it down to this level of distillation, as you were saying, actually that can really shorten the learning curve for the next generation of systems engineers. And I think that's a very, very important point to bring up there. And I think that's what we've okay, it's not complete by accident, but we've been surprised at the way we haven't been surprised that the books have been received positively. We wanted that, but actually the different ways in which people are using them as well, and it's very encouraging, and I think it's good news for the whole series as well. And so, I mean, we've got 4 Don't Panics at the moment. We've actually got another 4 being written at the moment, We got 3 in the broad area of integration and test. So Paul's actually one of the authors of those, all sort of kind of like with yours and the architecture framework ones, so complementary ones. And then we've got your one on design and designing. So it's starting to gain some momentum. And what we're also finding is that people like to have them on the shelves as well. We've had a number of people that have said they like buying, you know, they bought all 4, obviously because they wanted to read them, but they do look nice on the shelf when you see all the spines lined up and all the same kind of graphics and so on. So were you pleased with the, I've got to ask this because Simon's on holiday today, unfortunately, otherwise he would have been with us, but he makes me ask this, but it's really him asking, did you like the design of the books and the covers and so on? Please say yes.
Well, I certainly enjoyed the bright colours.
Yeah.
The distinctive fluorescent colours against the grey background. I do think there's, you know, he's made an attempt to make it accessible and a bit light-hearted and a bit fun. So I think that works really well, actually.
I think they're quite stylish, visually attractive, which I think is always helpful in a book. I sometimes, well, I'm sitting in my library here, and I lost heart when a 1,000-page book dropped through the letterbox one day.
Yeah, it wasn't mine, was it?
Particularly when I had to start reading some of it to do with work. So you know, they are fairly brief. Although I did hand a copy to the head of engineering in my organisation, and I think he was a bit taken aback when he saw the words "Don't panic."
Yeah. Well, you see, that don't panic aren't aimed at heads of engineering. That's where Think Engineer comes in. That's aimed at the head of engineering. That's the level we're pitching that one up. So I'm just going to go back to Paul Davies for a second. So I've noticed he's had his hand up for a couple of minutes. So Paul, have you got a comment at this point?
Yeah, a couple. Well, first of all, you're a bit of a victim of your own success. I can't remember who it was now, but there's some working group out there saying, oh yeah, what a great idea. You've latched onto the appeal of the title and say, we're going to write a Don't Panic book. So you want to work out how you want to manage the usage of that phraseology in book titles, because it's nothing to do with the UK, and it is certainly not going through your approval process. But that wasn't my question. The question was about architecture and design. Sometime late last year, and I'm not quite sure how, I got involved in an online conversation with Hilary Sillitoe and Eric Herzog, who's the sort of chief systems engineer of Saab Aerospace. I don't know whether either of you were involved in that, but Eric, who's a pretty deep thinker, was he runs hundreds of people involved in aircraft design, basically, and they're not really comfortable with thinking about anything that doesn't go clang when you kick it. So Eric was trying to work out whether internal to Saab they needed a distinction between architecture and design, because generally speaking it's the same people doing both, and there is, if you make a separation, there is a messy transition between the two, which is an opportunity to lose coherence, shall we say. So he took the decision, we're not going to bother, we're just going to have one set of internal processes that do both and ignore any arbitrary distinctions. So first of all, have you thought about that idea for your forthcoming book, or is there room for a little section on only make the distinction if it makes a difference to your business?
It is a very interesting point. So in doing some of the research to put this current design book together, we've come across a number of interesting things. For example, it was news to me that there wasn't really a distinction between design and manufacturer until the 1800s. They were regarded as the same activity, essentially, apparently. And I think we see this sort of increasing fractionation as disciplines mature. So we've seen in the early 15288 standards, there wasn't a separation between architecture and design as such. There's a thing called architectural design. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that architecture was considered to be a part of design, and it's gradually become separated as the skills and the set of issues to be considered have become more precise and more separated from the later stages of design. So you can certainly think of architecture as being the first stage of design, and if you read the design books, it's probably quite similar to conceptual design. And it applies particularly when you've got very complex systems, enterprise level systems. It's more useful in that sort of context to think about architecture than it might be, say, for a simple product like I don't know, a hammer or something, where you wouldn't necessarily benefit from introducing that extra step about architecture. So I think it is a reflection of the maturing of these various disciplines. I think even within architecture as a discipline, there are now people who are, well, who badge themselves as evaluation specialists, and that's their job. They do architecture evaluation and they don't do anything else. As Tim was telling me earlier on today, in fact, that he has a colleague who does precisely that. So that would be my answer. I think there's a kind of historical perspective which is quite useful for shedding light on the relationship between architecture and design. And then as to whether you want to separate them conceptually or even in terms of skills or job titles or whatever, I think that does depend a lot on exactly which kind of system you're trying to deal with.
Okay.
So to add to a little to that, there are a lot of complex issues, and I think it's a very good point you bring up, Paul. You know, there are issues which perhaps longer books are required to fully address. You know, the relationship between concepting and design and architecting, when architecting and design are driven by functionality and when they're driven by properties, we're beginning to understand better some quite deep issues in the different types of systems engineering you bring to bear for different types of systems and enterprises, services, etc. So it's work in progress, but hopefully when we have written the design book, we'll bring some clarity to the issues of the relationship between architecture and design and where they overlap, or where if one is a stage of the other. You know, it is a maturing process. We're learning as we do some of the research to write these books and delve into the literature and look at the different traditions and the history, which is what we're doing. We're not just sitting down and writing the stuff, you know, without referring to and drawing from a whole series of traditions and viewpoints.
Yeah,
good. I can see Paul's already working on his question list for the next Meet the Author section for the new book, so which I think is going to be interesting looking back. We've got a question from Stephen again. So Stephen Parry, do you want to make your thoughts known?
Hello again. Yes, so I'm interested in if you got, given that you're talking looking towards design and the separation of design and architecture. I'm interested if you've got any thoughts about systems thinking versus design thinking, and is there such a thing as architectural thinking if design and architecture should be separated? Where does that take us?
Well, Tim's been looking at that a little bit. Yeah,
so Mike mentioned that we'd written some sections of the update to the INCOSE International Systems Engineering Handbook to version 5. In fact, we'd written some sections on the design definition process to make it more general and to reflect approaches that weren't purely driven through the architecture, for example, so encompassing bottom up. I also wrote a section, and I'm not sure whether it will make it into the handbook or not, on the subject of design thinking, which is perhaps as significant an influence potentially into systems engineering as topics like systems thinking. And again, there are different schools of thinking different schools of thinking, sometimes along national boundaries. So there are different approaches to design thinking from different parts of the world. And you see, even in different companies, different takes on design thinking, leading perhaps to house styles, for example. Architecture thinking perhaps is something which is going to emerge. It's not something I've read too much about, but perhaps there is a mindset for architects, you know, and they draw on a broader set of principles and experience, and you know, perhaps it should be consolidated in the same way as design thinking or systems thinking. So it's a very interesting point you've made. Mike, do you want to add to that?
Well, I was going to say that, in fact, there's quite a lot of similarity, I think, between what you might call systems thinking and architectural thinking. So the basic conceptions of what a system is and how you need to engineer it are, I think, very, very similar to the idea of architecture. The thing that architecture is really doing is trying to focus on fundamentals, really, and not to get too bogged down in details that don't really drive the way you have to go about doing the system design. But I think, you know, that sort of idea of looking at what's important is embedded within systems thinking anywhere. Focus on what's important. Design thinking is a little bit different, I think, in that it's I think it is embraced within good systems engineering, and good systems engineers will be doing design thinking without necessarily realizing it, because it's about understanding what the requirement is and how the system's going to be used and all those kinds of things, and injecting the right degree of creativity and so on, which I think is part and parcel of systems engineering. It's just we don't use the language of design thinking so much. It's one of those situations where there's a lot of progress being made in parallel across different disciplines without them necessarily acknowledging or taking cognizance of what's been done elsewhere sometimes.
Okay, excellent. So very good question there. Some very thought-provoking, thorough answers there. So thanks for that one, Stephen. So we've got a few minutes left then. So I just want to sort of start drawing a conclusion here, to ask you a few more sort of generic questions. So what I'll usually ask at this point is, you know, were you scared off by the whole Encoder UK review process and publishing process? But I think, bearing in mind you're coming back for more, that kind of answers that in a way, because you're obviously not that horrified. So hopefully you haven't been too scarred by that. So what are your thoughts on the experience of going through the reviews? Because and I think, you know, I've worked with a number of different publishers in the past, and I would actually say that the process that we put in place, our review process, is actually quite a lot more rigorous than some of the other book review processes that I've been involved in the past. So any sort of high level thoughts on that?
We had a really bit of good fun trying to guess who the reviewers were, in fact.
Yeah.
So we reckoned some of them were quite distinctive, and we could probably pin them down pretty accurately.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have a conversation in private about whether our guesses were correct or not. But,
yeah.
But no, I mean, the review process, well, it's the same for any kind of publication, isn't it? You know, if you're submitting to a journal or whatever, you would expect to have a peer review process. Generally speaking, they can be either helpful or not. And happily, I think in this particular case, the comments were all pretty helpful. It's not always possible to address them because sometimes it's just would involve too radical a change in order to really reorganize the information or whatever. But we certainly spent quite a bit of time trying to address the comments to a degree of satisfaction, because they're all well-made points, and in fact we had review comments from some colleagues as well that we tried the drafts out on, and also took cognizance of that as well. So it's very hard when you're in the depths of writing and you're very familiar with what you said, and you know what it was supposed to say and what it was meant to mean. It's very easy to get confused by that when somebody fresh comes in and says, well, yeah, no, I didn't take that away from what you'd said at all. I understood something completely different. So yeah, it's really valuable to get the comments.
Okay, so Tim, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, my benchmark is the ISO editorial process,
Right.
and everything has got to be less painful than that.
Well, I mean, I think the average lifespan is only 2 ISO review processes, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm counting down the number of standards I can work on in the remainder of my life.
Yeah.
Is that bad? So, you know, my heart sinks every time I get 1,200 review comments on a standard, and then you've got to work your way through them and either agree with them or write a written disagreement and rationale. So it's a much lighter process than that. The comments were very helpful, and I think the fact that we knew, you know, yourself, John, and Simon helped in the process. We weren't dealing with unknown faceless people, but people we actually knew, and we knew generally where you were coming from.
I had one of the reviewers from one of my IT, but he will never see this. It doesn't mind. His name was Yasser Arafat, but it wasn't the ex-chairman of the BLO. It was some guy. So that made us chuckle slightly. It shouldn't have done, but it did. But I think also with regards to the comments, one of the things that we do try to do with these books, and we've succeeded, I'd like to say, very well so far in this, is we always make sure that the people writing the books are names and that they're well known and well respected in the field. And I think that makes a big difference with the review comments as well, because when people know who you are and they know they can, you know, even if they disagree with you, everybody, you know, people have different opinions, and that's fine, but you know, being known and respected in the field makes a big difference. So when you pick up the book and you see those names on the cover, and the same with Paul and the same with James and Aurelius who have written the books. So and I think that that's something that is really to be applauded as well, and I think that's a large part of the success of your particular book as well, is just the fact it's got your names on the front as well, and I think that makes a really big difference, because it is something that, as with my Incosa UK hat on, we can hold up and be proud of, and just say, you know, we've got the best people to write this series of books, and we're selling them around the world, and I think that's, you know, due in no small part to the caliber of the authors that we've had so far. So and I think that's you know, that shouldn't be forgotten. You know, the people involved are very important. That's one of the reasons why we run these sessions, is so that people can meet you and kind of get to know you. And that brings us rather neatly to the end of our session today. So it's like when we've done all of these sessions, I think we could have talked for hours, but the good news is we'll be back in a year or so with the Meet the Authors for the Design and Designing book. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending. In particular, obviously, I'd like to thank Tim and Mike for joining us, for taking the time out of their busy lives on a Friday, particularly on a Friday afternoon, in coming joining us. Hopefully, we'll see you at the ASEC 2021 later this year, and maybe we're playing around with the idea of maybe having a Meet the Author session there as well, a live one where we can get all of the current authors together. And I think something like that might be fun. So on behalf of myself personally and on behalf of Incosa UK, thanks Tim and thanks Mike for joining us. Thank you everybody for coming along. If you haven't dipped your toe into our book so far, please do. They're all available on the Incosa UK website and the store section. And as we said, they're going to be made available on Amazon within the next few weeks. So hopefully, certainly by July 2021, they should be available on Amazon, and the ebooks will be available as well. Far lighter to carry and easier to post when you're abroad. So on that note, thanks very much, guys, and we'll see you all soon.